Alright, good evening, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting Awe. Alright, tonight I'm going to reset the eyelashes with some very thinly blended liquid linseed oil and black paint, and then line in the first 3 trees, I think. One right here, one probably right here, and another further in the background. And I'm going to start from there with some simple black line work, a red oxide, and a red ochre fill, and then some bright pink for the apple blossom leaves. Okay, here we go.
Mark talked about alienation. And alienation is a good word as a theme for today, because what does it actually mean? Well, alien is a stranger. So what happens in alienation is we become strangers to something. And the concept of alienation, what do we become estranged from? What do we become strange to? Well, following along Marxist works, we can be alienated from ourselves. And I'm going to be telling you that the essence of trauma is actually disconnection from the self. So since we'll be talking about trauma today, I might as well tell you what my understanding of trauma is. Now you don't have to take on this understanding, but when I speak about it, I want you to know what I mean by it. So trauma, well, when James and Kim were on stage, and Kim was relating that James had asked her, what happened to you? What happened to you? That's a great question. Because in a Western diagnostic modeling, which I was trained, we don't ask people what happened to you. We ask basically what's wrong with you. What's wrong with you? And diagnostic categories assume that there's something wrong with the individual. It's a very different question asking what happened to you. Because now you're no longer asking about some physiological or mental event inside the individual, but you're putting the person in the context of their environment. So that's very important. But when it comes to my understanding of trauma, it's not actually what happened to you. That's an important question to ask. But that's not what trauma is. So trauma is not the ACEs as such. Trauma is not the physical or the sexual or the emotional abuse. Trauma is not the fact that your parents fought and divorced. It's not that your parents was fought in jail, or there was violence in the family, that your parents were addicted, that you were neglected. That's not the trauma. Those are the events that induce the trauma. But what is the trauma itself? The trauma is not what happens to you, but what happens inside you as a result of what happens to you. So trauma is something that happens within. And the word trauma itself comes from the Greek word for wounding. So trauma is a wound. Now, if you can imagine a wound on your flesh, you're cut by a sharp object.
Whoops.
What happens
that brush stroke was good.
Is pain.
Fuck that up pretty fiercely. Most of them are okay though. Okay.
There's some loss of function perhaps, and then the scar forms. And the scar is not the same as normal tissue. The scar is hard, so it doesn't feel so much.
There we go. That's going to be reglazed anyway.
The scar is not flexible like ordinary connective tissue.
It's all that it will be.
So
this is not the final layer. This is
we're more rigid in our
bringing the detail back out so I don't lose it completely
and we don't
before
feel as much.
Drown it again.
That's what the trauma is, what happens inside you. So when we speak about alienation, the first alienation is actually from ourselves. And the essential alienation in trauma is that disconnect from the self. And I'll be expanding on my concept of trauma as the day goes on, but just begin with that. So that trauma basically is a disconnect from the self. Which is where recovery comes in. And I might as well give it away right now. The word recovery is interesting. Because what does it mean to recover? To recover means to find something. But if you find it, it means it could never have been destroyed completely. It could never have been obliterated. We just lost sight of it. We lost contact with it. And I'm not going to answer the question at this point, but I'm going to ask you to consider, what is it that we cover? What is it that we recover when we do recover? And in considering today on trauma and adversity and resilience and recovery, what is it that you want yourself to recover, to find again? What is it that you want your friends and your children and your clients and the people that you work with in whatever field you endeavor you're in, whether it's justice or health or childcare or education? What is it that you want people not to lose, or if they do lose it, to recover again? So that first alienation is from ourselves. The second alienation is from our work. Now, I got a browsing the web this morning, I found an article that just was published today in Canada, or yesterday I should say. The majority of Canadian men are so stressed out by work that they're sleep deprived, eating poorly, skipping breaks, and dragging themselves to the office even when sick, without realizing the serious damage they're doing to their health. And they found that 81% of Canadian men said their work was stressful, while 60% said their work was impacting the quality of their sleep. Well, Mark said that the second alienation is actually from our work. We've been estranged from our work. The third alienation is from other people, and I'll talk about that as an outcome of trauma. We become estranged from others. And the fourth is the alienation from nature. And if you want to look at what's happening to nature in our culture, in our world today, just look at the whole issue of climate change. Look at the movement here in Britain, where people were demonstrating in the tens of thousands. Well, that shows you how alienated the society is from nature. We're so alienated from it that we're actually destroying it. Well, these are major alienations that I'm sure Jimmy Reed today would endorse as being the ultimate challenges to humankind. Having said that, what do we find when it comes to health in this world? Well, I'm writing a new book. It'll be entitled The Myth of Normal, Illness and Health in an Insane Culture. That's actually the title. And what are the facts? Well, the facts when it comes to a quick perusal of my research that I've done for this book, I'm looking at worldwide. In Scotland, apparently, the drug death rate is very high, roughly 2.5 times of that of UK as a whole. And drug deaths are increasing throughout the Western world. In the United States now, every 3 weeks, you have the equivalent of a 9/11. In other words, the number of people who died as a result of the terrorist attacks on September the 11th, was it 2001? That many die every 3 weeks from drug overdose in the United States. In Scotland, there were roughly 1,000, I think, overdose deaths over the last 3 years annually. In Britain, the numbers are going up. Now, I think last year there were 4,000 drug overdose deaths in Britain as a whole. Or was that just in England? I'm not sure. But think about it this way. If only one person a day was killed by terrorists in the UK, if every day terrorists killed one person a day, imagine the public alarm, imagine the outrage, imagine the mobilization of resources, imagine the sheer energy that we will put into stopping this assault on human lives. Well, many more die of totally preventable causes every day. For example, drug overdoses. And I'm only talking about the illegal drugs. What about people who die of alcohol disease, alcohol-related diseases, which number again is over 1,000 a year in Scotland alone? What about the ones who die of smoking-related causes? What about the people that die of the other illnesses that are associated with adverse childhood experiences? such as, for example, autoimmune disease, such as, for example, malignancy. Where's the outrage? Where's the mobilization of public resources? Where's the daily discussion in the newspapers? Where's the fevered debate on the broadcast media? Barely even registers. What is that all about? What does it say about our society? That these far more devastating and deadly threats
Craziest Kate.
are
Dinner time? Is that what this
so far in the background, whereas we keep prattling on about the threat of terrorism as being the major challenge of our society. What is the reason for that shift of focus from what's really going on to something that's a real but relatively minor disturbance? The number of children being diagnosed everywhere in the Western world with all manner of disorders, so-called medical disorders, and I say so-called because you'll be hearing from me that these so-called childhood disorders, these so-called childhood diseases, are not diseases at all. They're genuine problems, but they're not. The disease model doesn't account for them. The number of kids being diagnosed with ADHD, which by the way I was diagnosed in my 50s, and I'll tell you about that later on. The number of kids being medicated. In Britain, in the last 10 years, the number of prescriptions for antidepressant medications has doubled. And I could go on with the statistics. 1/3 of British adults are now pre-diabetic, apparently. Childhood obesity, 1/3 of British children are obese now, which makes them prone for diabetes and other illnesses. And I could go on and on with the statistics. But how are we to understand all this? That's the question. Now, you would think, for example, with a problem like addiction, if we actually stop to think for a minute, if what we're doing is not working, there could be two explanations for it. Let's just focus on addiction for a moment. If what we're doing is not working, there could be at least two possible reasons. One possible reason is that addiction is this intractable, chronic, incurable disease that there's just not a whole lot we can do about it. It's a genetic condition, it's rooted in our inheritance, and damn it, we just don't know how to fix it because it's so resistant to any human intervention. That's one possibility. The other possibility is, could it be that maybe we don't understand it? Could it be that maybe the way we're approaching it simply does not reflect reality? And if that's the case, why don't we take a look at what's going on? We need to have a new look at it. It's entirely possible that it's not intractable, that it doesn't need to be chronic, that it does not need to be so hopeless in its outcomes that we manage to cure only a small percentage, but that actually it's amenable to human approaches if only we knew what it was really all about. So, at least for today, I'm just inviting you, especially those that are professionally trained like I am, to suspend the framework in which you usually think about these things, and let's just see if a different framework might throw more light on the situation. Now, what is that framework? That framework is not new either. Just as alienation is not a new concept, the framework that I'm going to propose now is also not a new concept. So let me give you a couple of facts. There was a study 2 years ago in the United States that showed that
Oh, you're doing fuzzy.
the more episodes of racism a black American woman experiences, the greater the risk for
It's
asthma.
not snack time yet.
So the more racism she endures, the more her risk for asthma. We've also known for decades the more stressed parents are, the more risk their child has of having asthma. So there's some relationship between stress and asthma. Now it's very interesting. If you have an asthmatic episode in which your lungs have trouble moving air in and out because the airways have narrowed and run into spasm, and they're inflamed, further obstructing the flow of air. If you go to a physician like myself, you'll be given medications to suppress the inflammation and to open up the airways. The medications, those of you that are medically trained, you know what they are. They're copies of adrenaline and cortisol. The cortisol suppresses the inflammation, and the adrenaline relaxes the airways. What are adrenaline and cortisol? They're stress hormones. We're treating asthma with stress hormones. And we know that there's this relationship between stress and asthma. Now, if you actually look at medical practice, and those of you that are medical practitioners or the recipient of treatment will know this, that in many conditions across the board, we give the stress hormone cortisol. For inflammations of the skin, you go to a dermatologist, you'll be given a cortisol cream. For inflammation of the intestines, like Crohn's disease or colitis, you'll be given steroids, the stress hormone, at some point. Inflammation of the lung, the same thing. Inflammation of the nervous system, as in multiple sclerosis, the same thing. We're giving stress hormones across the board, but in general, as a profession, we don't ask ourselves the following simple question. Gosh, we give you stress hormones for everything. Could stress have something to do with the onset of these conditions? It seems like an obvious question, but we don't ask ourselves. Let me tell you another fact. I just mentioned multiple sclerosis, which is represents really a degeneration of the nervous system, without going into the details. Inflammation and loss of the protective sheath around the nerves. So you become numb and paralyzed, you might not be able to see, and so on. Let me tell you a statistical fact. At least in North America, and I'm pretty sure that British statistics would be parallel to this. In the 1930s, 40s, the gender ratio of multiple sclerosis was about 1 to 1. You know what so for every man diagnosed, a woman would be more or less. You know what the ratio now is? 3.5 women to every man. Now what does that tell us? It tells us it can't be genetic, because genes don't change in a population over a few decades. It can't be the food or the climate, because that doesn't change more for one gender than the other. There's got to be something going on. That's environmental. It's clear. Now what that is, I'm not going to say just yet. But I want to give you the framework. In Western medicine, we tend to treat organs. Now let me ask you the following question. I'm not sure show of hands. If in the last 5 years you've had reason to go to any kind of a specialist, a consultant, otolaryngologist, a throat specialist, or a respirologist, a lung specialist, or a cardiologist, or a neurologist, or a dermatologist, gastroenterologist, any kind of an ologist, just raise your hand, okay? Thank you. Now put your hand up again if in the course of that visit you asked about your childhood experiences. Put your hand up again if they ask about stress in your life. Now we see a couple of hands. Put your hand up if they ask you about how you felt about yourself as a person, about your relationship with your spouse. Yet I'm telling you, those questions, I hope at least to indicate to you by the end of the day, were completely relevant to whatever cause took you to the position in the first place. So in Western medicine, we tend to separate things. And now, I'm not a militant critic of my own profession. It's a beautiful profession with astonishing achievements to its credit. I don't have to tell you that. But I'm not looking at what doesn't work. I'm looking at today at what we miss, I think. So we tend to separate the mind from the body. We tend to separate, we tend not to believe that what happens to people emotionally has a role to play in their physiology and therefore their illness and health, number one. And we tend to separate people from their environment. So we see people as discrete individuals and actually not even as whole persons, but more as a collection of organs, each with their own particular set of diseases. Well, in 1977, there was an American physician, an internal medicine specialist, who also developed some expertise in psychiatry. And his name was Dr. George Engel. And George Engel called for what he called a biopsychosocial approach. And he said that the modern practice of medicine, he said, separates the mind from the body. And we look at molecules, and we look at organs, and we look at cells, and we look at organ systems, but we don't look at the whole person, and we don't look at the whole person in the context of his environment. So he called for what he called the biopsychosocial model, which is very simple. Biopsychosocial simply means that our biology is inseparable from our emotions, and since our emotions are very much modulated by our social relationships, therefore you can't separate biology from emotions and from our relationships. Now, relationship is the word that Suzanne emphasized this morning. So the biopsychosocial model actually looks at the individual in the context of their emotional lives and their social lives and their particular relationships. So that's the biopsychosocial model, which is to say that life is inseparable, that life is a unit, that life is one. And that's not a new idea either. 2,500 years ago, the Buddha said that, he says, contemplate what he called the interconnected co-arising of phenomena, which means that everything that arises, every phenomena that arises is related to everything else. He says, think about a leaf or a raindrop, he said. A leaf contains the sun, because of course without the sunlight there's no photosynthesis, there's no chlorophyll, there's no life. The leaf contains the sky, because the irrigation, the water, and the earth, of course, the minerals. So in that leaf, you don't understand that leaf. See, it's interesting, like, I know this intellectually, but when I go out for a walk outside, I still only see a leaf. My mind is not grasping that that leaf contains everything. And yet that's the nature of life. The nature of life, that everything does contain everything else. And this was said really well by the American author Susan Griffin, who said that the story of one life cannot be told separate from the story of other lives. Who are we? The question is not simple. What we call the self is part of a larger matrix of relationship and society. So this idea of the separated, individualized self is a myth. Had we been born to a different family in a different time, to a different world, we would not be the same. All the lives that surround us are in us. So it's from that perspective now that I want to look at first addiction, and then more broadly mental health and physiological health in general. So let's look at addiction. Now, for 12 years I worked in Vancouver's downtown east side, Vancouver being Canada's westernmost large city on the Pacific coast. And it contains an area called the downtown east side, which is North America's most concentrated area of drug use. So that within a few square block radius, we have more people ingesting, inhaling, and injecting illegal substances than anywhere else in North America. And anybody who visits the downtown east side is shocked by the suffering and the drug use, the people injecting in the streets or in the back alleys, the poverty. So I worked there for 12 years. And in my book, In the Realm of Hunger Ghosts, Close Encounters with Addiction, I describe a scene where there's a memorial service for a patient of mine who died of an overdose. And as I said in other talks of mine, if the success of a physician is to be measured by the longevity of his patients, then truly speaking, I was a failure, because my patients died often. They died of overdoses, of course. They died of sometimes suicide, violence, of all kinds of illnesses related to addiction, hepatitis, HIV, and so on, infections of all kinds. And so in this scene, in the second chapter of the book, I describe a memorial service for a 36-year-old woman. Her name is Shannon. She died of an overdose. I look at the small cluster of human beings gathered at the funeral of a comrade who met her death in her mid-30s. How powerful the addiction, I think, that not all the physical disease and pain and psychological torment can shake loose its lethal hold on their souls. Nothing sways them from the habit. Not illness, not the sacrifice of love and relationship, not the loss of all earthly goods, not the crushing of their dignity, not the fear of dying. The drive is that relentless. How do you understand the death grip of drug addiction? What keeps penny injecting after the spinal abscesses that nearly made her paraplegic? Why can Beverly give up shooting cocaine despite the HIV, the recurring abscesses that had to drain on her body, and the joint infections that repeatedly put her in hospital? What could have drawn Shannon back to the downtown east side after a suicidal habit, after a 6 months getaway? Well, what's the answer to that question of what is this death grip? The dominant answer in Western culture, I should say internationally, is that it's a choice that people are making, owing to some kind of a failure of will, moral weakness,
Okay.
A desire for pleasure.
All right, that leaves us with
only
only about 40 seconds here, so I'm going to cut that and pick up with a second take
And I'm considered to be asocial.
to stare and perhaps do another tree or two, since we're going to be doing another session anyway.
Prevent, tell school kids not to
Take
throw
two.
us in
I
the
just got
back.
pain on my camera.
And we call that prevention.
Put that back a
And let me
little
tell you,
bit.
it's totally useless. Or we then punish people for engaging in that behavior. Now, how do we punish people? And Harry Brunner talked about this in his TED Talk. How do we punish kids in our society? In a 2-year-old, I don't know what the practice here in Britain is, but I'm pretty sure it's the same. In North America, most parents were taught that when a 2-year-old misbehaves, what you do if they will not be brought to order is to give them a timeout. Which is to say, you can't be in my company, you can't be with me because your behavior doesn't please me. So we give them a timeout. And then they become adults and they still do stuff that is not to our liking. We also give them a timeout, and that's called a prison. We say to them, you can't be with us. And as Harry points out in his talk, when a kid is acting out in school, so let's say a bully, you say, we exclude you, you can't be with us. So basically, we withdraw from them something that's essential for human life, which is human contact. And that's what we do. And we do this because we believe that addiction is a matter of choice. So it's hard to keep up with the American cabinet these days. It's like a revolving door. One dysfunctional person replaces another. But the most recently resigned Attorney General, the chief law enforcement officer in the U.S., made the following statement along this line that addiction is the choice. He said, we need to say, as Nancy Reagan said, just say no. Now, if you don't know this, Nancy Reagan, who was the wife of Ronald Reagan, Reagan, who was the sole brother of Margaret Thatcher. And when you become the first lady, they call it, the wife of the president, you have to have a cause. You just have to have a cause. So they all choose a cause. Her was drug prevention. Their idea of drug use prevention was to put up billboards on the highway saying, just say no. Just say no. And so now the Attorney General, 2 years ago, made the speech where he said, we need to say, as Nancy Reagan said, just say no. Don't do it. And our nation needs to say clearly once again that using drugs is bad. It will destroy your life. In the 80s and 90s, we saw campaigns stressing prevention. We can do this again. Educating people and telling them the terrible truth about drugs and addiction will result in better choices by more people. Now, just as successful that Just Say No campaign was in preventing drug use is illustrated by the fact that every 3 weeks in America, as many people die of overdoses as did in 9/11. You know, once I was invited to the Senate of Canada. Canada's got a Senate like America. It's not as powerful as the American Senate, but they do debate and discuss issues. And I was invited to address them, a subcommittee of the Senate, on a new drug law proposal which would have made things more harsh for users, and of course the law was passed. But these senators were asking me all these questions, and I was telling them all the science that I understood about addiction, which I'll tell you about in a little while. But of course, I wish I could say that it went in one ear and out the other. It never even went in one ear. They just kept repeating the same questions over and over again as if I had said nothing. And I finally said to them in a somewhat exasperated state, well, look, senators, you expect me to practice evidence-based medicine. How about you practice evidence-based politics? Because the evidence about the punishment model when it comes to drug addiction is in. It's not controversial. It's completely useless, and worse than useless, it's harmful. And then he said, we can reduce the use of drugs, save lives, and turn back the surge in crime that inevitably follows in the wake of increased drug use. That's not true either. It is not true that a surge in crime follows increased drug use. What is true is that a surge in crime follows increased drug use in the context where drug use is criminalized. It is not the drug use that leads to crime. I mean, yes, if you drink alcohol, which is perfectly legal by the way, you might become more violent because you'll be disinhibited. And it's also true that crystal meth and the stimulants can make you violent or very aggressive. That's also true. But most of the crime is not drug-fueled crime when it comes to addiction. Most of the crime is around trying to desperately to obtain the drugs that are illegal. And when in North America there was prohibition in the 1920s and 30s, so you couldn't legally buy alcohol, there was a surge in crime. Not because people were drinking more, but because the alcohol was illegal. So there's no evidence behind those statements. I'm not going to spend more time on the choice model. It's just utter nonsense. You've never met, I've never met anybody who ever woke up one morning and said, my ambition is to become a drug addict, or my ambition is to become an alcoholic. That's just not how it works. So the second model, which is worth considering, because it has a lot of truth to it, without being true, is the medical model. And in the medical model, addiction is a disease. It's the American Society of Addiction Medicine defines addiction as a primary brain disorder. So it's a disease that arises in the brain, and it affects circuits of reward and incentive and impulse regulation and decision making. And because you got this brain disease, you got this disturbed brain physiology, now you've got this brain disease. How does the brain disease arise? It arises mostly because of genetics, about 40 to 70% genetically determined. And then you meet a drug, and now you have this genetically predisposed brain that meets the drug, and now you're hooked. Now the disease model is certainly more forward-looking than the choice model because at least you're not blaming somebody, at least theoretically you're not blaming somebody. You can't blame somebody for inheriting the wrong genes. And if somebody's got a chronic disease, just as you would deal with malignancy or rheumatoid arthritis or chronic depression, you don't blame people for relapsing. You even punish them for relapsing. And you also offer them treatment because you get that they're suffering as a result of their illness and you want to alleviate that suffering. So the medical model is far more humane and forward-looking, but is it adequate? Does it cover the science? Does it take into account the human experience and addiction? I say it does not. For one thing, it doesn't explain the non-drug addiction.
All right, so that gets the first 3 trees
Is there really a gambling
blocked
gene?
in, roughly. We still got a few minutes, so now I'm going to cut in a moon above
Is there really
her
an online
right
video game
arm
gene?
hand.
Number one. Number two, let me give you a definition of addiction that I don't think is controversial. And I'm going to ask you a question. So I'm going to define addiction as any behavior, at least it's a complex process, physiological, psychological, yes, but that manifests in any behavior that a person finds temporary pleasure or relief in, and therefore craves, but suffers negative consequences as a result of, and is unable or unwilling to give it up despite those negative consequences. So I said, so the hallmarks of addiction are craving, pleasure, relief in the short term, negative outcomes in the long term, refusal or inability to give it up despite those negative consequences. Now notice that my definition said nothing about drugs. Obviously it doesn't include drugs. Substances of all kinds. Could also be gambling, as James was saying this morning, sex, video games, work, extreme sports, relationships, shopping, eating, and one will go on and on and on. So any behavior like that. So according to that definition, craving, relief, pleasure in the short term, negative consequences in the long term, difficulty giving it up. How many of you would acknowledge that at some time or another in your life you've had some kind of an addictive pattern? Just put your hand up. Yeah. Well, put your hand up if you didn't put your hand up. Because you want to know how you did it. What I'm saying is that addictions are rife throughout this society. It touches almost everybody. And if you understand what it's really all about, I'm going to ask you a very simple question. And I'm going to ask just some of you in the front row so I can actually hear you to raise your hand if you're willing to and tell me. I'm going to ask you not what you were addicted to, not for how long, or when, just whatever it was, whenever it was, what did you like about it? What did it do for you? So if you're willing to tell me in the first few rows, just so I can hear you shouting at me, raise your hand, okay? Yes? To dissociate, to escape. Now, let's look at that for a moment. When does a person have to escape? When does a person have to escape? It's when they're suffering. Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Sorry? In pain? So it's escape from pain, is that what you're saying? So pain relief, is that what you're saying? Yeah, so it's pain relief. So escape from suffering, discomfort, pain relief, what else? Yes? Escape from loneliness so that it gives you a sense of social contact. So social relationships, number 3. Pick one more maybe. Yeah? See? Comfort. Comfort, okay? Now your desire for comfort implies discomfort. Okay? So let's just look at these. Escape from suffering, pain relief, social relationships, comfort. Are all these not genuine human needs? Are all these not genuine, normal human desires? Anything wrong with them? In other words, the addiction wasn't your problem. The addiction was your attempt to solve a problem. And the question is, why were you in pain? And how is it that you didn't have the resources internally to deal with that pain, or how is it that you're in a position where you didn't know how to ask people to help you with your pain? How is it that you had to escape from suffering? I mean, suffering happens in human life. That's just suffering is a fact of life. It doesn't mean we have to become addicted. We become addicted when we don't know how to deal with the suffering. And there's a reason why we don't know how to deal with that suffering. So that's the problem. Why are we so lonely? There are 7 billion human beings on this earth. Why are we so isolated and incapable of finding human contact that you had to seek solace in an addiction? And what made you so uncomfortable? And if I want to ask those questions, I have to look at not at your brain physiology, not at the supposed choices that you made, but at your actual life. At your actual life. So on one level, in other words, I have to ask, like James asked, Kim, what happened to you? That's the first question. Now let's look into addiction in a bit more deeper fashion. But on the first level, on the broader level, on the basic level, it's simply an attempt to solve a problem. And if you want to understand why the addiction, you have to look at, well, what's the problem here? And how did that problem arise in that person's life? What happened to you? That's the first point. Second point is, I was diagnosed myself in my 50s, about 20 odd years ago now, with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And typically, one of the traits of ADD, or attention deficit disorder with or without hyperactivity, is poor impulse regulation. In other words, you want to do something, and it's, even though it's not a good idea, you still end up doing it because you can't control your impulses. So a very simple explanation or example of impulse regulation would be, if I was hungry right now, I had enough breakfast perhaps, and you sitting in the front row had a piece of fruit in your hand, and my impulse would be to grab that fruit and bite into it. That's the impulse, just arising from sheer hunger. Nothing wrong with the impulse, but there'd be something wrong if I acted it out, because it's your fruit, not mine. And I'm giving a talk right now. I'm not getting paid to eat fruit in front of you. So that's okay, because it's a part of my brain right here. That's okay, Gabor, you may be hungry, but that's not appropriate to grab that fruit right now. That's impulse regulation. Now, kids with ADD don't have impulse regulation. Adults with addiction don't have impulse regulation, and I'll talk about that later. And there's another large group of human beings who completely lack impulse regulation. Absolutely lack it. So what do we call those people? Did you say politicians? Yeah. We won't go there. Even larger than that, we call them young children. Infants have absolutely no impulse regulation. What does that tell us? It tells us that impulse regulation has to develop. It has to develop.
All right, so that's still going to take a whole lot of work, but that gets some of the ground elements starting to develop. The first 3 trees in, moon above her right hand, and some eyelashes and eyebrows started, which will all be probably reglazed as I highlight and develop the entire scene together now that each piece is starting to fit together. So that's it for the moment. Thank you for watching. It's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Mexico, working on oil painting. Have a good night, Earth.